The Graveyard Shifty in New Hampshire is the title of this one. Many people walk gingerly through cemeteries. That's natural, considering what lies below. But we humans are not the only beings that tread dark places lightly. Spirits are also said to waft softly over headstones. And this next encounter involves something that was not human, not dead, and perhaps not even canine. But it's another good illustration of unknown creatures and cemeteries. So here is a very detailed report I received of an incident in New Hampshire in mid-October of 2014. The man, who wished to remain anonymous, wrote that he had come home one chilly Tuesday night that fall at about 12:30 a.m. and saw that what he had first thought was a deer, very reminiscent of some accounts we've seen earlier in this book. Evidently, there's been some deer stories. But anyways, he realized it was not a deer as it walked on its hind legs. He said it was tremendously thin and was taking poodle-like baby steps at a high rate of speed. That sounds kind of funny. I did not see any tail, but I knew it was definitely not a Bigfoot. I could not believe it, but at no time did I feel threatened. I was not afraid, just surprised. I kept staring at it. I couldn't figure out what I was looking at. It did not seem to pay any attention to me at all. He said he was not able to see its arms, but it had a triangular head with small eyes and a short face, and struck him as both cat-like and wolf-like all at once. Its fur was quite short. It seemed to have walked across a commons area that was about 60 feet away, standing just inside the tree line of some woods. It appeared to have come from the direction of a nearby colonial-era graveyard. Behind the cemetery were some historic buildings and an embankment that led down to a river called the Mountain Stream. It continued to head south silently, but at a fast pace, and was soon lost from sight. He added that there were houses nearby, and speculated that the creature may have taken shelter in a shed next to an old church. He said, "Now I believe those stories people said about the hostile werewolf types, and I believe there are different types of these dogmen. I just happen to see the more timid of the types." He added that seeing people go into the cemetery always made him cringe without knowing exactly why. Cemeteries are just one type of site often connected with wolf-like creatures, especially upright canines that act like phantoms or bear a resemblance to Anubis, ancient Egypt's jackal-headed god of the dead military zones. Ancient Egypt's jackal-headed god of the dead, often seen in military zones. So these Anubis-type werewolf creatures have been seen in military bases. I take that to mean. Following is one of the most recently submitted, though the events took place in the early 70s. I was just going to say one thing about the last reading, is that the one thing I thought of was Wendigo, just with the deer type form. I don't know if you've talked about that before on here, but
we did not.
Okay, well, maybe that's a good one to talk about.
Yeah, it is. But what also, in a way, bugs me that these demonic creatures would be okay being close to a church, any church, like. Because usually you hear stories they are afraid of churches as sacred spaces, which under the teachings of the Divine Council, biblical theology, especially in the Old Testament, the so-called sacred places and geographical location where God dwells, you would expect them not because of superstitious reasons, not because of what we see in horror movies, but you would expect them to be maybe not afraid, but to just simply avoid churches. But this creature came to dwell not in the church but close to the church, so I'm a little bit bugged because of that. I'm a little bit upset because I would think they'll be like running away from it. I don't know.
I have some thoughts on that. When I think of sacred space, I think of the human heart, more so than I think of an actual space, right? So in temples in the ancient Near East, the temples were the sacred space, but when Christ died for us and was resurrected and sent the Holy Spirit, now we're all building stones of the temple, right? So every human, and every time you get a new believer that becomes a believer, that's what's expanding or retaking the ground or retaking sacred space of the world, because it's people's hearts that are the temple. So I kind of think, when I think about like some of these old churches and things, it's almost very similar to, you get these Catholic, and I'm not going to say anything bad about Catholics, because I know a lot of really great Catholics, so I don't mean to, if you're listening, you're Catholic, I'm not, this is not a dig, but I think people that, and maybe it's any denomination, right, that they're more religious than they are actually in a relationship or having given their lives to God, if you've given your life to God, that's different than, I think I'm going to do these rites and these rituals and follow these laws and rules, and that's going to do anything for me. That's not the mindset. The mindset of being a believer is desiring God above all other things. God should be your fundamental, greatest desire, is Him, and not even the gifts He gives, but Him as a person. And that's what a relationship with Jesus is. And so I feel like that's the type of thing that if you have a church like that, or a community like that, or a house like that, that's going to be where the demonic cannot go to those places, or can at least not have a very great effect at those places. But if you have an old church, maybe it was an old church that was abandoned, and maybe it was a church that you just didn't have a believer community there, or maybe since it's an old church, it's not considered sacred space anymore, because now it's just a building. It's not the people of God. It's not the community of Jesus, So that's kind of what, when I think about that, I resonate with you, because that's my first feeling as well, is, why I would think that would be somewhere with a creature like that wouldn't go. But then I think about the fact, one of my, actually on my podcast, one of my guests, I think you might have her on in one of your upcoming episodes. She actually had her first encounter with the supernatural in the Catholic Church where she went as a child. And so she can tell that story if she's on the podcast. So I think sacred ground, it's more about the human heart than it is about, a place.